Throughout American history, there exists a peculiar economic phenomenon that few wish to examine too closely. While soldiers have died on distant battlefields, their families grieving at home, certain families back in the United States have grown exponentially wealthier. This is not the story of individual merchants or opportunistic traders who occasionally benefited from wartime demand. Rather, this is the story of 5 families whose fortunes became so intertwined with American military conflicts that their wealth trajectories tracked almost perfectly alongside the nation's wars. Their names appear and reappear across centuries of American warfare, suggesting not coincidence, but something far more systematic. A structural relationship between their business interests and America's military involvement abroad. The story begins not with gunfire, but with chemistry. In the early 19th century, the DuPont family recognized something that many others missed. Explosives were going to be the foundation of modern warfare. Eleuthère Irénée DuPont de Nemours immigrated to America with knowledge of French powder-making techniques, and by 1802 established his operation along the Brandywine River in Delaware. What followed was a century of timing that seemed almost too convenient. Every time America needed explosives, the DuPont company appeared ready to supply them. During the War of 1812, the firm supplied substantial quantities of gunpowder to American forces. During the Mexican-American War, their explosives were essential to military operations. The Civil War became a transformative moment for the company, turning it from a successful regional manufacturer into a truly national powerhouse. The Union Army required staggering amounts of gunpowder, and DuPont provided it at profitable rates, accumulating the capital that would allow the company to expand into other chemical industries. By the time of the Spanish-American War, at the turn of the century, the DuPont family had evolved beyond mere powder production. They had integrated into steel manufacturing, ammunition production, and a dozen related industries. Their network of influence extended through government supply contracts, political relationships, and strategic partnerships with railroads and banks. When American forces fought in Cuba and the Philippines, they fought with DuPont explosives, often delivered on DuPont-connected railways and financed through DuPont-connected banking institutions. The family's wealth during this period reflected more than just successful business acumen. It reflected a positioning within the American military-industrial system that made them indispensable to warfare itself. The Rockefeller family's relationship with warfare operated through a different mechanism, though with equally consistent results. Standard Oil, established by John D. Rockefeller in 1870 built monopolistic control over petroleum refining and distribution. What made this relevant to American warfare was something Rockefeller understood with almost prescient clarity. Wars increasingly would be won by the side with access to reliable fuel supplies. As naval vessels transitioned from coal to oil, as military vehicles proliferated, and as aviation emerged as a revolutionary military technology, petroleum became as strategically important as ammunition. During World War I, Standard Oil and its successor companies supplied massive quantities of refined petroleum products to American forces and to Britain and France through American supply channels. Rockefeller family members would later claim they had no particular interest in whether America entered the war or remained neutral. This claim suggests a remarkable misunderstanding of business logic. A war involving America would dramatically increase demand for petroleum products. Remaining neutral would limit such demand. While the family maintained a facade of political neutrality, their enormous petroleum infrastructure was positioned perfectly to profit from American entry into the conflict. After America entered the war in 1917, petroleum demand skyrocketed, and Rockefeller family fortunes expanded accordingly. The pattern continued into World War II with even greater clarity. The vast mechanized warfare that characterized the Second World War required petroleum supplies on a scale that would have astonished earlier generations. Aircraft burned hundreds of gallons of fuel per operational hour. Tanks and trucks consumed massive quantities. Naval operations depended entirely on reliable fuel supplies. The Rockefeller family's oil interests positioned them to supply this demand, and the family wealth expanded proportionally. By the end of the war, the Rockefellers had become substantially wealthier, not through any innovation in oil extraction, but through their fortunate positioning within a global conflict that required exactly what they produced. Then came the Cold War, and subsequent military interventions that defined American foreign policy for decades. Each conflict in Korea, Vietnam, and the Middle East required petroleum. Each crisis in the Persian Gulf affected oil prices and supplies. The Rockefeller family maintained strategic influence over American energy policy, international relations concerning oil-producing regions, and military logistics. Their wealth continued to accumulate at rates that exceeded normal economic growth, correlating precisely with periods of military conflict and military spending increases. The DuPont and Rockefeller families represented the classical model of war profiteering. Provide essential materials that warfare cannot proceed without. Position yourself as the reliable supplier, and watch wealth accumulate. However, other families employed more sophisticated mechanisms. The Morgan family, represented primarily through J.P. Morgan and his successors, operated at the level of financial intermediation. Rather than supplying physical goods, they financed military production and supplied the credit that allowed governments to wage war. During the Civil War, J.P. Morgan engaged in complicated financial arrangements that generated personal profit while also financing the Union's war effort. His operations straddled the line between patriotic service and self-interested finance in ways that later observers would find troubling. Morgan would buy war bonds at discounts and sell them at premiums, capturing the spread. Morgan partnerships would arrange loans to governments desperate for credit to fund military operations. These arrangements were profitable not because they were unethical, but because war finance operates under conditions of urgency that eliminate the normal constraints on lending rates and terms. By the time of World War I, the Morgan family had evolved into something approaching a shadow government of American finance. Morgan banks arranged the massive loans that allowed Britain and France to purchase American military supplies. Morgan partnerships managed funds that flowed into munitions manufacturing. Morgan connections influenced which American corporations received military contracts and which remained outside the war economy. The family's wealth during this period grew not because of individual genius, but because of a structural position within the financial system that made them the intermediaries between American industry and American military spending. The pattern became even more refined during the World War II period. The Morgans were not alone in this financial intermediation role by then, but their successors maintained crucial positions. However, one must also consider how financing warfare differs from supplying goods. Suppliers profit once, when their goods are purchased. Financiers profit repeatedly, as the borrowed funds create obligations that extend across years or decades. The interest on war debt becomes a persistent revenue stream flowing toward financial intermediaries regardless of whether particular wars end. In this sense, the Morgan family and financial institutions they influenced had an interest not merely in wars occurring, but in wars requiring maximum military spending and maximum debt. The DuPont, Rockefeller, and Morgan families represented the original patterns of war profiteering that characterized the 19th and early 20th centuries. However, the post-World War II era introduced new mechanisms and new families into the system. The Eisenhower administration's famous warning about the military-industrial complex reflected a reality that had already crystallized. Warfare had become structurally intertwined with American capitalism in new ways. Defense contracting emerged as a permanent feature of American economy, not something activated only during wartime, but an ongoing permanent sector generating consistent revenue. The Carnegie family's earlier family, wealth, accumulated through steel production during America's industrialization and wars, provided the template for this evolution. Andrew Carnegie sold steel to the government for railroad expansion, bridge construction, and military vessels. His successors at US Steel maintained these relationships through subsequent decades. However, the post-1945 period saw a more sophisticated arrangement emerge, in which specific defense contractors maintained close relationships with military planning institutions, generating an incentive structure that favored military spending increases, extended military commitments abroad, and wars themselves. The Harriman family exemplifies this later evolution. Averell Harriman's family wealth originated in railroad fortunes, but Harriman himself served in senior government positions while maintaining private business interests. His movements between government service and private enterprise created a revolving door mechanism through which government military policies could be shaped by people with direct financial interests in high military spending. Harriman served as ambassador to the Soviet Union, later to Britain, then took positions in the Truman and Kennedy administrations. Meanwhile, his family maintained substantial investments in defense contractors. This arrangement allowed government policy to be influenced by people who would directly profit from military conflicts and expansions of military spending. What emerged across the mid-20th century was not a conspiracy in any dramatic sense, but rather a system of incentive structures that aligned the interests of wealthy families with the interests of the American military establishment. Defense contracts flowed to specific companies in which these families held significant interests. Military spending increased systematically after World War II, not declining as would have been typical after previous wars, but remaining elevated and expanding. Military bases remained permanently positioned around the world, requiring ongoing spending. The military-industrial complex that Eisenhower warned against was not a conspiracy, but rather an emergent system in which the financial interests of these families became aligned with the interests of the military establishment, the defense industry. The Korean War provides a clear illustration of how this system operated. When North Korea invaded South Korea in 1950, American military production capacity had been allowed to contract from its World War II peak. Equipment and ammunition needed to be produced for a war that politicians had not anticipated. Defense contractors, many connected through stock ownership and board positions to families like DuPont and Rockefeller, suddenly had enormous orders. Military spending surged. The Eisenhower administration, despite Eisenhower's later warnings about military-industrial influence, presided over a defense budget that expanded substantially to supply the Korean War. The war itself remained limited in scope, but higher military spending relative to its actual strategic importance to the United States. After Korea came the vast expansion of military spending associated with the Cold War competition with the Soviet Union. This spending bore little relation to actual war, but carried the same effect of enriching defense contractors and the families associated with them. When President Kennedy took office, defense spending increased further, driven partly by genuine security concerns, but also influenced by the structural incentive alignment that had developed. The Bay of Pigs invasion, the Berlin crisis, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and various military deployments all occurred within an administration that had close ties to defense contractors. Defense spending increased under Kennedy despite few of these crises resulting in actual warfare. Then came Vietnam, and the system displayed its full functionality. The war in Vietnam represented the first major test of whether the military-industrial complex would perpetuate a conflict primarily because of financial incentives. By most standard historical and political analyses, the Vietnam War was not in American national interest. The conflict consumed enormous resources with minimal strategic benefit. Yet, it continued for years despite mounting evidence of its futility. Simultaneously, military contractors in which wealthy families held interests generated unprecedented profits. Boeing supplied aircraft. General Dynamics supplied missiles. Lockheed supplied helicopters. These companies were connected through board memberships, stock ownership, and political influence to the family networks that had profited from previous conflict. Elithaire's descendants at DuPont still held significant influence in American corporate life. DuPont maintained substantial operations in chemical production, including production of chemical defoliants used extensively in Vietnam. The company supplied explosives, propellants, and materials essential to the war effort. Similarly, Rockefeller-connected petroleum companies supplied the vast fuel requirements of military operations in Southeast Asia. The financial institutions connected to Morgan's successors arranged the financing necessary to support the war. Harriman family interests remained connected to defense contractors and to foreign policy through continued government service and board positions. The Vietnam War demonstrated something troubling. A war could persist not because of clear strategic necessity, but because of structural economic incentives. The war continued long past the point at which most observers recognized it as unwinnable, partly because stopping it would have required massive defense industry contraction and would have reduced the profit streams flowing toward defense contractors and the families connected to them. When the war finally ended, it had cost nearly 60,000 American lives and millions of Vietnamese lives, while enriching the very families and corporations whose business interests aligned with military conflict. The pattern persisted through the late 20th century with only slight variations. The Reagan administration of the 1980s oversaw a vast expansion of military spending, driven partly by genuine concern about Soviet military growth, but also reflecting the structural incentive alignment toward military spending that the military-industrial complex had created. Defense contracts flowed to corporations in which wealthy families held interests. The defense budget doubled during the Reagan years. Meanwhile, Soviet collapse eventually rendered much of this increased military capacity strategically unnecessary, but the spending trajectories proved difficult to reverse. The end of the Cold War presented a crucial test of whether military-industrial incentives had truly become structural. One might have expected defense spending to decline significantly with the disappearance of the Soviet threat. Instead, defense spending remained elevated and found new justifications. The 1991 Gulf War served this purpose, demonstrating that military capabilities created incentive structures for their use. When Iraq invaded Kuwait, America had accumulated an enormous military infrastructure and defense industry capacity. The war provided an opportunity to demonstrate the utility of this infrastructure and justify continued spending. Defense contractors and the families connected to them profited from equipment sales, upgrades, and the expansion of military presence in the Middle East region. The 21st century warfare followed established patterns with remarkable consistency. After the 2001 terrorist attacks, vast expansions of military and security spending occurred. Defense contractors connected to wealthy family networks received unprecedented sums for equipment, services, and infrastructure. The wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, like Vietnam decades earlier, continued despite mounting evidence of strategic futility. Trillions of dollars flowed into defense spending over nearly 2 decades of war that produced minimal strategic benefit for the United States. Yet this immense expenditure clearly benefited defense contractors, their investors, and the wealthy families connected to them. The relationship between war and defense industry profit had become so normalized that it barely required investigation. Presidents from both parties presided over military spending increases. Defense contractors maintained permanent lobbying operations in Washington. Retired military officers accepted corporate board positions with defense contractors upon leaving uniform. Military strategy decisions appeared, at times, driven less by strategic necessity than by contractor availability and capability. One must be careful in interpreting this pattern. The argument is not that wealthy families deliberately created wars to generate profit. Rather, the argument is that structural incentives evolved over a century in which the financial interests of these families became increasingly aligned with military spending and military commitment. Wars served multiple purposes and resulted from multiple causes. However, economic incentives supported perpetuating conflicts once they began. Defense spending, once elevated, faced powerful political forces maintaining it at high levels. The families connected to this military-industrial complex accumulated wealth that exceeded what normal economic growth would have produced because they benefited from structural advantages and incentive alignment rather than pure market competition. The DuPont family's wealth by the 21st century, while diminished from its peak through various corporate restructurings and diversification, still represented one of America's great fortunes built substantially on relationships with military production. The Rockefeller family's oil interests, though challenged by geopolitical shifts and renewable energy transitions, remained embedded in the military fuel supply chains that continue to operate globally. The Morgan financial interests, transformed through various mergers and corporate evolution, remain connected to defense industry financing and military spending arrangements. The Harriman family's wealth, similarly transformed through corporate reorganization and succession, maintained connections to defense contractors and foreign policy formation. These families' connections to military spending had become so institutionalized that they no longer required active management but operated through structural incentive alignment embedded in government institutions and corporate networks. The mechanisms through which wealth accumulated operated at multiple levels simultaneously. Most directly, companies connected to these families received government military contracts. These contracts generated profits that flowed, in various forms, to shareholders and family members. More subtly, the presence of wealth and corporate power allowed families to influence policy in directions that served their interests. Political donations supported politicians favourable to defence spending increases. Board positions at defence contractors ensured family members remained informed about opportunities and connected to decision-making. Government service by family members or trusted associates ensured that military policy considerations incorporated the interests of the defence industry. A government defence official considering whether to maintain a military base, upgrade a weapons system, or extend a military commitment abroad would be aware, whether consciously or not, of the business interests involved. If the decision would generate contracts for major defence contractors, it would be supported by those contractors through lobbying, political contributions, and media advocacy. If the decision would reduce military spending, it would face opposition from the same groups. Over time, this created a subtle but powerful bias toward military spending increases and military commitment extension. The wealthy families connected to defense industries benefited from this bias, regardless of whether they consciously manipulated it. The most recent decades have seen this pattern continue with increasing sophistication. Private military contractors and security services have emerged as a new layer of the military-industrial complex, operating with somewhat different incentive structures but fundamentally similar wealth generation mechanism. These firms, in turn, have attracted investment from the wealthy family networks that grew wealthy, profiting from traditional defense contracting. The circle has continued to expand and evolve, incorporating new technologies, new corporate structures, and new mechanisms of wealth accumulation, yet maintaining the fundamental pattern. Opportunities for extraordinary profit flow toward those positioned to benefit from military spending and military conflict. This historical pattern does not require any group of wealthy families consciously plotting wars or government policies. Rather, it reflects how economic incentive structures, once established, tend to become self-perpetuating and self-reinforcing. When wealth becomes concentrated among families whose fortunes depend substantially on military spending, those families naturally develop interests aligned with military spending expansion. When these families also possess means to influence policy through political contributions, lobbying, government service, and corporate board positions, their interests will naturally shape policy directions, particularly when no opposing force proves powerful enough to counteract them. The tragedy is not primarily that a few families have become extraordinarily wealthy. Rather, the tragedy is that this wealth accumulation mechanism has shaped American foreign policy and military strategy in directions not obviously in America's broader national interest. Wars that might have concluded more quickly proceeded at extended length because military spending incentives supported their continuation. Military spending that might have declined after conflicts ended remained elevated, because the infrastructure and corporate interests supporting it proved politically durable. Resources that might have addressed domestic needs instead flowed into military industry and overseas military operations. Younger generations inherited a world of perpetual military engagement abroad and elevated military spending domestically, not because such arrangements served the nation's strategic interests, but because they served the financial interests of wealthy families and the corporations through which their wealth was mediated. The mechanisms of wealth accumulation deserve deeper examination because they reveal how incentive structures shape behavior at systemic levels. When a military conflict emerges and defense spending increases, the immediate beneficiaries are obvious. Defense contractors receive orders, workers in defense industries gain employment, and shareholders receive dividends. However, the wealth accumulation among the connected families operates through multiple simultaneous channels that compound each other. A family with investments in a defense contractor benefits directly from increased military spending. The same family members serving on corporate boards influence strategic decisions about which products to develop and which markets to pursue. Family members in government service ensure that military specifications and procurement processes favour products their companies produce. The family's wealth allows them to make political contributions supporting politicians who favour high defence spending, which creates pressure on military leadership to justify expanding military budget. These mechanisms operate independently but reinforce each other, creating cascading advantages that transform routine business success into extraordinary wealth accumulation. This layered structure became visible particularly clearly during the Cold War period, when military spending reached levels that would have been politically impossible during peacetime absent the perception of an existential threat. Throughout the 1950 and 1960, American military spending remained at unprecedented peacetime levels, generating profits that flowed through defense contractors to the families that owned them. The defense industry employed hundreds of thousands of workers, creating political constituencies that supported military spending, increases in every congressional district where defense manufacturers operated. This geographic distribution of defense industry employment effectively made military spending increases politically self-perpetuating. No politician representing a district containing defense contractors could safely vote against military spending increases without facing political consequences in their own elections. The structure that emerged resembled less a conspiracy than an ecosystem in which all participants had vested interests in the system's continuation and expansion. Military officers who developed specifications for new weapons systems knew that defense contractors would bid to produce those systems, generating profits that flowed to shareholders and executives. Defense contractors anticipated military demand and positioned their investments accordingly. Families owning substantial interests in defense contractors contributed to political campaigns of politicians supporting high military spending. The politicians received campaign funding that allowed them to achieve and maintain elected office. Military strategists developed doctrines that justified high levels of defense spending. The cycle became self-sustaining without requiring central coordination or conscious conspiracy. The geographic distribution argument deserves emphasis because it reveals how military-industrial incentives became embedded in political structure. By the late 20th century, every American state contained at least some defense industry operation. In some states like California, Texas, and New England, defense industry employment became a significant portion of the overall economy. Major defense contractors like Lockheed Martin, Boeing, General Dynamics, and Raytheon operated facilities throughout the country, ensuring that almost every congressional district contained at least some beneficiaries of defense spending. This meant that politicians from both major parties faced strong electoral incentives to support military spending increases, regardless of strategic necessity. The families that profited most directly from this spending were concentrated in wealth, but the indirect beneficiaries were distributed across the American population, creating a broad political constituency supporting high military spending. One might ask why this system persisted even when defense spending exceeded any plausible measurement of strategic necessity. Part of the answer lies in how military doctrine and strategy developed over the latter half of the 20th century. American military strategy came to emphasize maintaining military superiority, not just in total force, but in every technological category. This created a logic in which no level of military spending could ever be considered excessive, because any potential adversary might be developing new technologies that America needed to match or exceed. The logic of arms competition replaced the logic of strategic necessity, creating a framework in which military spending increases became justified by technological competition with adversaries rather than by rational assessment of actual military threats. The families that profited most directly maintained influence over these strategic frameworks through multiple channels. Board memberships at defense contractors provided access to corporate strategy discussions. Government service by family members or close associates ensured that military strategy development incorporated corporate perspectives. Political influence through campaign contributions and media influence shaped public discourse about military necessity. Think tanks funded by wealthy individuals with defense industry connections generated studies justifying high levels of military spending. Academic institutions receiving grants from defense contractors or from foundations controlled by defense industry connected families produced research supporting policies that aligned with defense industry interests. The Gulf Wars provide particularly clear illustrations of how these mechanisms operated in contemporary times. When Iraq invaded Kuwait in 1991, the United States responded with military force that required deploying vast amounts of military equipment and supplies. Defense contractors supplied equipment, ammunition, spare parts, and logistics support. The war lasted weeks but generated billions of dollars in military contracts. Some of this spending represented replacement of equipment consumed in the war. Other spending represented upgrades to military systems based on experience gained. Still, other spending represented new weapon systems introduced and tested during the conflict. The immediate profits flowed to defense contractors, but the longer-term consequences proved even more significant. The war justified the continued presence of American military forces in the Persian Gulf region, which required sustained military spending and military presence that benefited defense contractors for decades. When the United States invaded Iraq in 2003, the conflict consumed military resources on a scale that dwarfed the 1991 war. The extended occupation and counterinsurgency operations that followed the initial invasion required sustained military spending that continued for years. Defense contractors supplying equipment for Middle Eastern operations benefited from the extended conflict. Private security contractors emerged as a new category of defense industry participants, employing personnel for security operations throughout Iraq and Afghanistan. These private security contractors, while nominally different from traditional defense contractors, attracted investment from the same sources that profited from traditional defense industry operations. Wealthy families already invested in defense contracting diversified into private security operations, accessing new profit streams that emerged from extended military commitments. The Afghan war followed similar patterns. The initial invasion in 2001 responded to genuine security concerns and appeared to most observers as strategically justified. However, as the war extended across years and costs accumulated, the strategic justification became less compelling. even as military spending continued. Defense contractors benefited from extended operations in Afghanistan. Military bases and supply operations required continuous resupply from American contractors. Weapon systems deployed to Afghanistan required maintenance and replacement. The infrastructure built to support extended military operations in a landlocked Central Asian nation benefited primarily the companies supplying military equipment and services. That these contractors had connections through ownership and board positions to the wealthy families that profited from previous conflicts meant that the profits from Afghan war operations flowed through established channels of wealth accumulation. By the early 21st century, the war profit pattern had evolved substantially from its 19th century origins, but remained fundamentally unchanged in its essential operation. Wealthy families maintained strategic positions within defense, industry, and finance. These positions generated profits that scaled with military spending. Military strategy and foreign policy included assumptions and approaches that justified high levels of military spending. While genuine security concerns motivated some policy decisions, the structural incentive alignment toward military spending and military expansion created bias in the policy formation process that elevated military solutions over alternative approaches. The pattern will likely continue absent some fundamental disruption in the relationship between wealth concentration and military policy formation. The structural incentives that evolved over more than a century will not disappear through moral recognition of the problem. Political reform would require reducing military spending in ways that would require confronting the powerful political forces representing defense industry interests. It would require preventing wealthy families from using resources to influence policy. It would require ensuring that military strategy decisions reflected strategic necessity rather than corporate profitability. These changes face substantial barriers. The defense industry has become deeply embedded in American political structure. It influences both major political parties through campaign contributions, lobbying expenditures, and employment of retired military officers as corporate executives. Military bases and defense contractors operate throughout American geography, creating distributed political constituencies supporting military spending. The families that profited historically from this system have evolved and adapted, diversifying their fortunes while maintaining strategic positions in industries that depend on government spending and military operations. Their wealth provides access to political influence that shows no signs of declining. Younger generations of these families have inherited not just money, but positions within corporate and financial networks that generate ongoing profits from military spending, ensuring that future generations maintain incentives to perpetuate the system. Yet the historical pattern remains clear and undeniable. From the DuPont family's profitable supply of explosives through multiple wars, to the Rockefeller family's strategic positioning in fuel supply, from the Morgan family's financing of military expansion to the Harriman family's integration of government service and private interest, from historical patterns through the military-industrial complex of the post-World War II era to contemporary defense spending and military operations, a consistent phenomenon emerges. Certain families have systematically accumulated extraordinary wealth by positioning themselves within the military-industrial system. Their wealth trajectories have tracked the expansion of American military spending and military commitment abroad. The mechanisms have changed and evolved, becoming more sophisticated and institutionalized, but the fundamental pattern persists. Wars have come and gone. Administrations and policies have changed, yet these families have remained wealthier, their fortunes growing in alignment with American military expansion. Whether viewed as the inevitable operation of economic incentive structures or as a more deliberate mechanism of wealth accumulation through influence over military policy, the result has been the same. The United States has experienced systematic expansion of military spending and military engagement abroad, enriching those positioned to profit from such expansion while consuming resources that might have served other national purposes. This is the war profit pattern, and it has shaped American history and global affairs for more than a century. Understanding this pattern does not require believing in elaborate conspiracies or conscious coordination among wealthy families. Rather, it requires recognizing how financial incentives, once established and reinforced through institutional structures, tend to perpetuate themselves and expand over time, particularly when concentrated wealth provides leverage to influence policy formation. The result has been a military-industrial system whose continued expansion and operation serve narrow financial interests alongside and sometimes contrary to broader national interests. The families that profit from this system have no incentive to reform it, and the political forces they command have proven sufficient to resist reform pressures throughout recent American history.